The curtain of history often hides more than it reveals. In the ruins of war, beneath the rubble of collapsed empires and silenced voices, certain truths were deliberately buried. Today, under the file header "Pourquoi Truths Almost Lost to History Forever," we revisit 4 shadows from the Second World War. Not the stories of battlefield heroics celebrated in textbooks, but the suppressed records, sealed orders, and forbidden dealings that governments deemed too dangerous for public knowledge. These fragments of hidden history were scattered across destroyed cities, locked in intelligence archives, and erased from official reports. Yet traces remain: a classified order buried in Berlin's ruins, a forbidden pact to sacrifice convoys in the Arctic, atrocities erased for scientific gain in secret laboratories, and treacherous talks, whispered in Swiss mountain villas, where enemies became bargaining partners before the war's end. Each file tells of betrayal, sacrifice, and hidden motives, evidence of a war not merely of armies, but of secrets. These truths remind us that the greatest battles of World War II were not always fought with bullets and bombs, but with silence, deception, and deliberate erasure. What follows is a reconstruction of the forgotten files, spoken aloud as if they were never meant to be heard. Chapter 1. Classified orders buried in Berlin's ruins. The collapse of the Third Reich in April and May of 1945 was chaotic, brutal, and consumed by fire. As Soviet artillery hammered Berlin into dust, Nazi officials scrambled not only to save themselves, but also to conceal the most dangerous truths that had guided their secret dealings. Among the piles of ash and rubble, intelligence operatives later reported, lay a missing set of classified orders known under the codename Seelenschatten, translated, Shadow of the Soul. These directives were not typical operational commands for troop movements or battlefield tactics. Instead, they outlined negotiations designed to preserve the remnants of Nazi power beyond the battlefield. For decades, rumors circulated that these files had been hidden deep within the Reich Chancellery's underground vaults, burned or buried as the Red Army closed in. But fragments recovered by Allied intelligence suggested something far more unsettling. Not every German general intended unconditional surrender, and not every Allied leader wanted the full truth revealed. The origins of the Seelenschatten orders trace back to the final months of 1944. By then, the war on the Eastern Front was catastrophic. The Soviet Red Army had pushed across Poland and was preparing to breach German borders. Meanwhile, American and British forces advanced steadily after the Normandy landings. Defeat was inevitable. Yet, in discreet meetings in neutral nations, Switzerland, Sweden, and Spain, Nazi representatives began exploring escape routes for the regime's wealth and leadership. Gold stripped from Jewish victims, looted art, and industrial patents were quietly transferred through banking institutions in Zurich and Stockholm. Neutral intermediaries, such as Swedish businessman Birger Dalarus, acted as couriers and negotiators. According to one British MI6 memorandum dated January 1945, these channels facilitated more than financial transfers. They also opened discussions about relocating Nazi officials to South America, particularly Argentina and Chile, where sympathetic regimes were already signaling their willingness to provide safe harbor. When Berlin began to collapse in April 1945, Reich officials rushed to destroy or conceal incriminating evidence. Vast archives of the Sicherheitsdienst and Gestapo were set aflame. Yet the Seelenschatten orders were reportedly placed in sealed crates and hidden within the labyrinth beneath Wilhelmstrasse. A declassified OSS report from June 1945 records that US operatives recovered incomplete directives which describe coded banking, transactions and secret understandings with Swedish diplomats. These incomplete fragments raised an uncomfortable question. Had the Allies known of such negotiations? And if so, had they allowed them to proceed in silence? The report's margin notes include the phrase, "Compromise risk unacceptable, contain." It suggests that US and British intelligence agencies deliberately chose not to publicize the discovery. The Soviet Union, however, suspected otherwise. NKVD officers stormed Berlin with explicit orders from Stalin to secure financial and diplomatic records before the Western Allies could. Soviet intelligence believed that back-channel negotiations between Nazi officials and the West had occurred, potentially to limit Soviet territorial expansion in post-war Europe. Whether true or not, this suspicion fueled decades of Cold War mistrust. Moscow's archives contain letters accusing the United States of concealing the full scope of Germany's secret arrangements. It was more than propaganda. It was rooted in fragments of truth that both sides preferred to obscure. The secrecy extended beyond politics into the murky world of post-war reconstruction. Documents suggest that industrial assets, including patents for advanced aircraft designs and chemical technologies, were included in the Seelen-Schatten files. These were later mirrored in Western scientific programs, from jet propulsion research to pharmaceutical developments. The connection between looted Nazi knowledge and post-war Western prosperity remains a delicate subject, one seldom acknowledged openly. The orders hinted at a systematic effort not only to preserve wealth, but also to transfer scientific dominance to those willing to look the other way. The suppression of these records was not accidental. A memorandum marked "Most Secret, Eyes Only" from the British Foreign Office, discovered in 1978, contained a chilling directive. To preserve stability in Europe, exposure of clandestine Reich negotiations must remain restricted indefinitely. This statement highlights the calculated decision to bury the past, not for justice, but for political convenience. It was easier to prosecute the visible monsters, Göring, Himmler, and Kaltenbrunner, than to explain why bankers in Zurich or envoys in Stockholm had quietly enabled the Reich's survival in exile. The Nuremberg trials, monumental as they were, avoided certain economic and diplomatic questions. The Seelen-Schatten files may explain why. Testimonies from Nazi fugitives in South America add weight to these suspicions. SS officers like Josef Mengele and Adolf Eichmann, who successfully escaped to Argentina, were sustained by financial networks established before Berlin fell. Argentine intelligence archives, declassified in 1992, describe substantial transfers from European banks between March and May 1945, corroborating the very transactions outlined in the fragments recovered from Berlin's ruins. These were not isolated escapes. They were part of a structured effort, a hidden migration prepared in advance. The buried orders were the blueprint. The question then arises, who benefited most from the concealment of these truths? For the Western Allies, suppressing evidence of back-channel dealings avoided diplomatic crises with neutral nations, many of which became important partners in the Cold War. For the Soviets, claiming the West had betrayed them strengthened their narrative of perpetual vigilance against capitalist treachery. But for the victims of the Reich, for the millions whose gold and lives had been stripped away, the concealment meant that justice remained incomplete. Much of the stolen wealth was never recovered. Entire art collections vanished into private holdings, protected by banking secrecy and buried under sealed orders no court would ever see. To this day, historians struggle to reconstruct the full story. Many files remain classified, with large sections redacted under the justification of national security. The scattered fragments of Seelen-Schatten remind us that history is not merely written by the victors. It is edited, sanitized and purged. In Berlin's ruins, amid the flames and shattered stone, truths were deliberately buried to ensure survival. Not just for the individuals fleeing justice, but for the reputations of nations who chose silence over disclosure. What remains is a haunting reminder that the war did not end with the surrender signed on May 8, 1945. In the vaults of governments and in the vaults of banks, it continued in secrecy, guarded by the ashes of files too dangerous to be revealed. The buried orders of Berlin whisper across time, their shadows still lingering in the dark corners of archives and the polished walls of financial institutions. They are a reminder that beneath every official surrender lies another story, one of clandestine deals and erased truths. The war's end was not a clean break, but a quiet handover, carefully concealed beneath rubble and secrecy. What was meant to stay hidden has surfaced, piece by piece, to show us that victory was far less absolute than the public was ever allowed to believe. Chapter 2, Forbidden, Pact of the Arctic Convoys. The Arctic convoys to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk were among the most brutal supply missions of the Second World War. Between 1941 and 1945, Allied merchant ships loaded with tanks, trucks, aircraft, fuel, and ammunition set sail from ports like Liverpool, Loch Ewe, and Reykjavik, bound for the Soviet Union. Their route took them across the icy waters of the Barents and Norwegian seas, where German U-boats prowled beneath the waves and Luftwaffe bombers circled above. Sailors endured endless hours in sub-zero temperatures, ice crusting their decks, frostbite spreading across hands and faces. The convoys were essential, a lifeline for Stalin's war effort, yet their cost was horrific. Thousands of men lost, hundreds of ships sunk. Official history blames the ruthless conditions and German ambushes, but buried in declassified fragments, a darker possibility emerges. Certain convoys, intelligence suggests, may have been deliberately sacrificed by the Allies themselves, not out of incompetence, but out of necessity, to conceal the greatest secret of the war, the breaking of the Enigma code. Convoy PQ-17 remains the most infamous disaster. In July 1942, 35 merchant ships departed Iceland, carrying tanks, planes, and ammunition. They were heavily escorted by British cruisers and destroyers. Yet, on July 4th, Admiralty orders reached the convoy. The escorts were to withdraw. The merchant ships were ordered to scatter, sailing alone across a vast ocean now infested with submarines and bombers. The result was catastrophic. 24 of the 35 ships were destroyed, their crews lost in fire and freezing seas. Survivors later described it as abandonment, a betrayal beyond comprehension. Officially, the Admiralty justified the order by citing the supposed threat of the German battleship Tirpitz, rumoured to be moving into attack position, but post-war intelligence analysis revealed Tirpitz never engaged. The convoy had been left exposed unnecessarily. Why? The answer may lie in signals intelligence. By 1942, Britain's code-breaking centre at Bletchley Park had achieved significant success in decrypting German naval Enigma transmissions. Under the programme codenamed Ultra, these decrypts provided invaluable insight into U-boat positions and Luftwaffe patrols. However, their very use posed a danger. If Germany suspected Enigma was compromised, they would change the cipher system, erasing the Allies' greatest advantage. Thus, Ultra's existence was one of the most tightly guarded secrets of the war. Orders from the Admiralty were often designed not to save convoys, but to ensure German suspicions were never aroused. If an Allied response to an attack seemed too precise, too informed, it risked exposing the truth. In this light, PQ-17's sacrifice takes on a darker meaning. By scattering the convoy and allowing ships to be destroyed, British command ensured that Ultra remained protected. The lives of sailors became expendable pieces in a larger game of secrecy. Evidence supporting this theory comes from a declassified Admiralty file marked Most Secret Naval Cipher Room, 1942. Within its pages is a chilling annotation. Ultra cannot be compromised. PQ-17 risk unavoidable. Though heavily redacted, the document suggests that decisions were made with deliberate knowledge that ships would be lost. This aligns with testimony from surviving officers, who recalled confusion at orders that seemed irrational, even suicidal. One merchant captain wrote in his post-war diary, "We were not defeated by the Germans. We were abandoned by our own." The Soviet Union was furious. Stalin demanded to know why his much-needed supplies had been obliterated, yet the British provided only vague excuses, citing overwhelming German naval strength. Privately, communications between the NKVD and British intelligence showed deepening mistrust. A Soviet cable intercepted in late 1942 warned that Allied duplicity in northern waters shall not be forgotten. The Red Army's suffering on the Eastern Front, starved of promised equipment, deepened suspicions that the West was deliberately weakening them. Whether true or not, the seeds of post-war mistrust were planted in icy waters filled with corpses and burning oil. The pact that emerges from these records is not one signed on paper, but one etched in silence between intelligence agencies. British Admiralty officials, in cooperation with American naval intelligence, accepted losses as the price of protecting Ultra. It was, in their view, a calculation. Thousands of lives in exchange for a secret that would ultimately save millions. But for the men aboard the ships, the truth was crueler. They were sailing in convoys already marked for sacrifice, pawns in a game they could never understand. Convoys PQ-18 and PQ-19 suffered heavy losses as well, though less catastrophic than PQ-17. Each time, questions arose about the adequacy of protection and the curious withdrawal of escorts at critical moments. Meanwhile, Soviet demands for greater convoy protection grew louder, but were often delayed or minimized. In one British War Cabinet memorandum dated December 1942, Prime Minister Churchill himself acknowledged the grave political consequences of the Arctic disasters, but emphasized that Ultra must not be imperiled under any circumstance. In his characteristic bluntness, Churchill once said, "The sailor fights the sea and the enemy, but also fate itself." What he did not say, and what these files suggest, is that fate was sometimes determined not by the enemy, but by his own command. The human toll was staggering. Survivors of PQ-17, who were rescued from the freezing ocean, described bodies floating like ice sculptures, frozen stiff in lifebelts, their faces locked in expressions of terror. Others told of men trapped in burning oil slicks, their screams carried across the Arctic wind. These testimonies were quietly recorded but seldom published, deemed too damaging to morale and political unity. For decades, the official explanation stood: PQ-17 was a tragedy caused by the menace of Tirpitz. Only the gradual declassification of ultraphiles in the 1970s began to reveal another layer, one that historians still debate but cannot ignore. The forbidden Pact of the Arctic Convoys was not a written treaty, but a shared understanding. To protect the secret of Enigma, lives would be forfeited without hesitation. It reveals the cold calculus of wartime intelligence, where the line between strategy and sacrifice blurred into moral greyness. The sailors who froze and burned in the Barents Sea did not die in vain, their losses perhaps contributing to ultimate victory. Yet they also died in ignorance, never told that their suffering was engineered not by German might alone, but by Allied silence. As the Arctic waters closed over the wrecks, so too did history. For decades, the men of PQ-17 and other convoys were remembered as heroes struck down by overwhelming odds. The truth, locked away in cipher rooms and sealed files, remained untold. Only now do the fragments emerge, whispering across time. Some convoys were not merely lost, they were chosen to be lost. A secret buried in ice, preserved in silence and only now allowed to surface. Chapter 3. Erased Atrocities of Unit 731's Survivors. Hidden behind the official surrender of Japan in 1945 lies one of the darkest, most carefully erased stories of the war, the atrocities of Unit 731. Established in 1936 in the puppet state of Manchukuo in northeastern China, Unit 731 was formerly known as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. Its name suggested sanitation and health. In reality, it was a sprawling complex of biological warfare research and human experimentation that rivaled the horrors of Auschwitz. Led by General Shiro Ishii, a brilliant but ruthless physician, Unit 731 conducted secret operations near the city of Harbin. Behind its guarded walls, tens of thousands of civilians and prisoners of war were subjected to experiments so grotesque that the details remained buried for decades. What makes the truth unbearable is not only the scale of the crimes, but also the decision by American intelligence to erase them from history, trading justice for knowledge. The experiments defied imagination. Prisoners were referred to as maruta, or logs, dehumanized to justify their treatment. Chinese peasants, captured partisans, and even Allied POWs from Australia, the United States, and the Soviet Union were used as test subjects. Vivisections were performed without anesthesia, so scientists could observe the effects of disease on living organs. Men and women were deliberately infected with anthrax, cholera, plague, and syphilis. Some were exposed to frostbite experiments, limbs plunged into ice water until frozen solid, then struck with hammers to observe the breaking point of human tissue. Others were locked in pressure chambers until their eyes exploded. Women were raped and impregnated, so the vertical transmission of diseases could be studied. These acts were documented in clinical detail, stored in files stamped with the Imperial Army's Red Seal, hidden from the world. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, one might expect those responsible for Unit 731 to face justice. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the Tokyo Trials, prosecuted leaders for war crimes. Yet remarkably, the name Unit 731 scarcely appeared. None of its leading figures stood in the dock. General Ishii was never charged, never imprisoned, and lived quietly in Japan until his death in 1959. The reason lay in a series of secret negotiations between Ishii's staff and American intelligence, particularly the United States Army's Chemical Corps, and the newly established Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency. Between late 1945 and 1947, U.S. officers, including General Charles Willoughby and Dr. Edwin Hill from Fort Detrick, Maryland, reviewed the unit's files. They concluded that the data gathered from these atrocities was too valuable to discard. Immunity was granted in exchange for exclusive access to Japan's biological warfare research. The documentation was quietly shipped to Fort Detrick. Reports stamped "Top Secret" described human responses to plague bombs, aerosolized anthrax, and glanders. American scientists, desperate to outpace the Soviet Union in the looming Cold War, saw in Unit 731's crimes an opportunity to leap ahead. In a memorandum dated May 6, 1947, found in the US National Archives, a line reads chillingly, "The value to the US of Japanese BW data is of such importance to national security that it far outweighs the moral considerations." In short, justice was deliberately traded for scientific advantage. The atrocities were not only ignored, they were purchased. The Soviets, furious at being excluded, attempted to expose the truth. In December 1949, a war crimes tribunal convened in Khabarovsk tried 12 Japanese officers involved with Unit 731. Unlike Tokyo, this trial named names, detailing experiments and presenting testimony from both perpetrators and survivors. Witnesses described plague-infected fleas being dropped from aircraft, epidemics unleashed on Chinese villages, and the systematic murder of prisoners. Yet the West dismissed the Khabarovsk trial as propaganda, another Soviet attempt to discredit Japan and America. For decades, Western historians regarded the evidence with suspicion, even ridicule. Only with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the gradual release of declassified documents did the testimony prove, consistent with buried US files. What had once been branded lies emerged as unshakable truth. Survivors' voices were nearly silenced. In China, families of the victims lived with unanswered questions, many never receiving acknowledgement or reparations. Those who dared to speak were often ignored or accused of fabricating stories. One Chinese woman, interviewed in the 1980s, recounted how her father and brother were taken to the Harbin compound and never returned. She recalled seeing Japanese soldiers burn bodies behind the compound walls, the smell lingering for days. Her testimony matched reports that Unit 731 incinerated thousands of corpses to conceal evidence as the war ended. The erasure of these voices was not accidental. It was the deliberate outcome of intelligence deals made far from the fields of Manchuria, in the corridors of Washington and Tokyo. The consequences stretched into the Cold War. Biological warfare programs in both the United States and the Soviet Union accelerated after 1945, drawing directly from Unit 731's research. At Fort Detrick, scientists integrated Ishii's data into American experiments on anthrax and tularemia. Soviet laboratories in Sverdlovsk replicated plague bomb techniques described in captured Japanese files. The victims of Unit 731 thus continued to suffer posthumously, their deaths weaponized in the global arms race. The irony is stark. While Nazi scientists were publicly tried at Nuremberg, Japanese scientists who committed crimes of equal horror were shielded, protected, and even honored within their profession. Some later became professors, medical leaders, or corporate researchers, their past erased by silence. For Japan, the legacy of Unit 731 remains deeply unresolved. For decades, the government denied the existence of the program, labeling survivor accounts as communist fabrications. Only in the late 1990s did Japanese courts begin to acknowledge the truth, though official apologies remain limited and carefully worded. In 2002, a Tokyo district court acknowledged that Unit 731 carried out biological warfare, but denied compensation to survivors, citing legal limitations. The erasure was not complete, but the attempt to suppress memory succeeded in silencing generations. The erased atrocities of Unit 731 reveal more than the horrors of war. They expose how political necessity and scientific ambition can conspire to bury truth. They show how justice can be bartered away when nations decide that knowledge matters more than accountability. And they remind us that archives and trials tell only part of history. What is omitted often matters as much as what is recorded. For the men, women, and children who perished in Harbin's laboratories, there was no justice. For their families, there was only silence. And for the world, there was the haunting legacy of crimes deemed too valuable to punish. As we reopen these files, we are forced to confront a chilling paradox. Unit 731's survivors were erased not by death, but by deliberate forgetting. The atrocities did not vanish into history. They were hidden in plain sight, concealed by official denials, shielded by governments that benefited from their results. The story of Unit 731 is not only about what happened during the war, it is about what was allowed to remain unspoken after the war, when silence itself became a weapon more powerful than any plague bomb. Chapter 4: Hidden Treachery of Operation Sunrise Talks. By the winter of 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing into its final desperate months. The Allies had crossed the Rhine, the Red Army was closing in on Berlin, and German defences in Italy were crumbling. Yet in the shadows of this chaos, far from the front lines, secret negotiations began that revealed the fragile trust among the Allies was already fraying. Known as Operation Sunrise, these clandestine talks unfolded in the Swiss city of Bern, under the coordination of Allen Dulles, then the senior OSS officer in Switzerland. What began as discussions over the conditional surrender of German forces in Italy soon spiraled into something larger. A hidden negotiation over the post-war balance of power. These talks, shrouded in secrecy, were kept even from many Allied commanders, and when fragments emerged, they ignited suspicion and fury, particularly in Moscow. For Stalin, Operation Sunrise was not simply betrayal, it was confirmation of his deepest fear, that the Western Allies were striking a backroom deal with his enemies, positioning themselves for dominance in Europe once the war was over. The origins of the talks lay in February 1945. As German strength in Italy weakened, SS General Karl Wolff, Himmler's chief of staff in Italy, initiated contact with neutral intermediaries. Wolff, seeking to preserve his own life and secure leniency, proposed the partial surrender of German forces in northern Italy. He hoped such a deal might prevent the complete destruction of German units, while simultaneously positioning himself as a negotiator rather than a criminal. The Swiss intermediaries connected Wolff with Allen Dulles. For Dulles, the offer represented an opportunity, the chance to shorten the Italian campaign and perhaps capture valuable German intelligence before the Soviets could. Yet this opportunity carried immense risk, for official Allied policy demanded unconditional surrender, and Stalin demanded that all negotiations be conducted jointly with the Soviet Union. To exclude Moscow was to betray not just protocol, but the fragile alliance itself. Between March and April 1945, a series of secret meetings took place in Zurich, Lucerne, and Ascona. Dulles and Wolff, flanked by envoys, sat in private villas overlooking Swiss lakes, far from the front lines. These meetings were given the codename Operation Sunrise. At first, discussions focused narrowly on surrender terms for German troops under General Heinrich von Vietinghoff, commander of Army Group C in Italy. But gradually, the scope widened. According to a partially declassified OSS cable dated March 8, 1945, Wolff raised the possibility of preserving German positions in Austria, hinting at a negotiated halt to Soviet advances. He allegedly suggested that German troops might resist the Red Army more fiercely if granted lenient treatment in the West. For Stalin, when he later learned of these exchanges, this suggestion was evidence of conspiracy. The West might allow Germany to continue resisting in the East, slowing Soviet progress into Central Europe. The secrecy of Operation Sunrise enraged Moscow. On March 22, 1945, Vyacheslav Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister, sent a sharp letter to Washington and London, demanding clarification. The Soviet Union, he claimed, had been deliberately excluded from talks that affected the common Allied cause. In private, Stalin's fury was even greater. NKVD intercepts confirmed to him that the West was concealing the full scope of discussions. Soviet cables described the talks as treachery, a betrayal that reinforced Stalin's suspicion that Churchill and Roosevelt sought to block Soviet influence in Europe. Churchill, cornered by these accusations, insisted the talks were merely exploratory and held no binding commitments. Roosevelt, gravely ill at the time, attempted to calm tensions in one of his final letters to Stalin. Yet the damage was done. Trust was eroded at the very moment Allied unity was most critical. The historical record of Operation Sunrise remains clouded, in part because much of it was deliberately obscured. OSS reports from Switzerland were heavily redacted when transferred to the CIA after the war. Entire sections describing German offers remain blacked out to this day, but fragments that survive suggest that more than just Italy was at stake. In one heavily censored transcript, Wolff allegedly hinted at German scientific assets, jet aircraft designs, rocket programs, and chemical research that might be surrendered to the Americans in exchange for leniency. If true, this would mean Operation Sunrise was not only about ending the war faster, but about securing the spoils of German technology before the Soviets could claim them. This theory aligns with subsequent events, as Operation Paperclip soon relocated German scientists like Werner von Braun to the United States, bypassing justice in the pursuit of Cold War advantage. The the surrender in Italy did proceed. On April 29, 1945, German forces in Italy signed an unconditional surrender at Caserta, effective May 2. The talks in Switzerland had helped pave the way for this outcome, saving countless lives in the final days of the Italian campaign. Yet for Stalin, this outcome did not erase the insult. He remained convinced the West had attempted to bargain in secret, a suspicion that hardened into policy during the post-war division of Europe. At the Potsdam Conference later that year, Stalin referenced Operation Sunrise obliquely, warning that separate dealings with the enemy can never be forgotten. His words foreshadowed the Iron Curtain that would soon descend across the continent. The treachery of Operation Sunrise lies not in its results. The war in Italy ended sooner than expected, but in its method. By excluding the Soviet Union, the West confirmed Stalin's darkest suspicions. Whether or not broader deals were truly on the table, the secrecy alone poisoned trust. The Allies had fought together against fascism, but by 1945 they were already maneuvering against each other, each side seeking control over the post-war world. For the United States, Operation Sunrise represented pragmatic diplomacy, a means to secure surrender and intelligence. For Britain, it was a chance to limit Soviet expansion. For the Soviets, it was betrayal. The shadows of those meetings in Swiss villas cast a long darkness across the early Cold War. Operation Sunrise reminds us that wars do not end neatly with surrender documents. They end in smoke-filled rooms, in whispered deals, in secret telegrams sent through neutral channels. The talks in Switzerland, far from the blood-soaked battlefields, reveal the hidden war within the war. A contest not only to defeat Nazi Germany, but to shape the world that would rise from its ashes. In those hidden negotiations, alliances fractured, trust dissolved, and the Cold War was born. The treachery was not only Wolf's attempt to save himself, it was the betrayal of unity itself. A reminder that even as the last shots of World War II echoed across Europe, another war was already beginning. The stories unearthed under the file header, 4 Truths, almost lost to history forever, do not offer comfort. They remind us that war is not merely fought on battlefields, but also in the shadows, through silence, concealment, and deals never meant to see daylight. Classified orders buried in Berlin's ruins revealed a network of secret negotiations that smuggled power and wealth across oceans. The forbidden pact of the Arctic convoys exposed how human lives could be sacrificed to protect the secret of Enigma. The erased atrocities of Unit 731 proved that justice itself could be traded for scientific advantage, leaving victims without even the dignity of remembrance. And the hidden treachery of Operation Sunrise showed that even as allies marched together, their unity was already breaking apart in the smoke-filled rooms of Swiss villas. Each of these truths, suppressed and sanitized, challenges the simple narratives of good and evil we are taught about the war. They reveal a darker reality, one where betrayal, silence, and expedience shaped history as surely as armies and bombs. The question that lingers is not only what else remains hidden, but whether we are prepared to face those shadows if they ever surface.